Welcome to the Wisdom of the Body Summit, an online event to align with your body's intelligence for healing, optimal living, and spiritual awakening. Brought to you by Sounds True. Throughout this summit, 32 experts will share practical tools and breakthrough insights that have emerged from the convergence of science and time-honored perspectives from the world's spiritual traditions. As we learn to recognize and honor the incredible wealth of knowledge that lies within our bodies, we can begin to listen and attend to ourselves more fully, opening a doorway to greater health and well-being. Hi, everybody. Today, I'm excited to welcome Leslie Booker, who also goes by Booker, working for over a decade with the most vulnerable populations in New York City. Booker shares her expertise nationally as a public speaker, dharma teacher, and trainer in the efforts to support the sustainability of frontline change makers. Today, she'll be sharing a presentation with us that's titled, Embodied Wisdom is Not a Luxury Item. Welcome, Booker.
Thank you so much, Kriste. I'm really happy to be here and I'm really appreciating this conversation around embodied wisdom, around wisdom of the body, and bringing it to a larger audience. I was just sitting a monastic retreat last week, and I was speaking to one of my teachers about those of us who live our lives and teach from this place of intuition, from this feminine lens, and kind of how we have this sort of secret society of each other, and especially in the dharma world. And we're all starting to sort of come out and be transparent about the way that we live our lives, and the way that we show and articulate how we move through the world. And so this topic is coming at a really timely moment for me right now. Living through the wisdom of my body is a choice that I consciously decide to do every day with every decision that I make. And it's the choice to turn towards vulnerability, to turn towards my intuition, towards my deep sense of trust in my own system. I trained as a dancer from the ages of 3 until 19, and then I sort of disengaged from my body as a whole for about a decade. In my late 20s, I was introduced to the practices of yoga and meditation within months of each other. So at that time, I never really saw them in the same room with each other. During that time when I came to my practice, I had my yoga world, I had my meditation world, and the two very rarely came together. And I had not begun to study deeply at that point. I was just practicing. And so I didn't hear people speaking of this beautiful melding of these practices. And as someone who grew up really embodied, I just began to find that intersectionality and began to practice that way on my own. I couldn't understand how you could move the body without mindfulness, and how mindfulness didn't infiltrate every movement of my body. And so, of course, I found my people within about a year or so of practicing, and I began to study deeper and to teach out this intersectionality, also bringing in my social justice framework. When I was invited to train in the 4-year teacher training at Spirit Rock, I had a chance to sit down with Jack Kornfield, and he asked me how I was going to offer these teachings. He said that his generation before me, they were really interested in inviting more and more women to train and to teach, and to sort of dismantling this guru model that they had been trained under in Asia, and to really bring in more team teaching. So what are you going to do? He asked me. And without skipping a beat, I said, Jack, I'm going to bring the body back into mindfulness practice. In my experience in our Western culture, there is this conflation between the mind in mindfulness and the brain. So, mind and mindfulness is really about chitta. So, that's the Pali word chitta, which means heart mind. So, it's really more connected to this intuition, this more feminine way of knowing our experience. And, this brain that we are so obsessed with in this culture tends to be more of a masculine framework. And so our practice has become over intellectualized in Western culture. So we practice from sort of like the neck up, and sometimes it feels like we're just using our body as a vehicle to get our brain onto our cushion. And over the past few years, I've been really sitting with what that means to me to bring the body back to mindfulness. As a practitioner, as one who sits in the seat of a teacher, and as one who has a body that carries these physical identifiers, these markers of folks who have historically not been protected, who have systematically and legally been marginalized, and who have been harmed and who have been abused. And how every day I take this exquisite risk to use this body to live my truth unapologetically. To me, this is faith. And this faith manifests in all aspects of my life. It is a loyal and constant companion on my journey. As a new teacher, I'm still finding my voice, and probably will be for years to come as I explore the nuance and how I want to share these practices in a way that's inclusive to all beings. And at this point, in my first 10 years of teaching, this inquiry is also plagued with doubt and with fear. I realized early on that I couldn't leave part of me outside of the meditation hall, that I needed to bring the entirety of who I am when I sat on the dais. Early in my practice, I sat a personal retreat with Bhante Buddharakkhita, who is a Ugandan monk in my lineage, and he also founded the Uganda Buddhist Center. I went there to practice and learn with him for a few weeks, and as I was preparing to leave Uganda, I asked him for advice. I was going back with all of this new wisdom and knowledge and going back to my life in New York City. And so I said, Bhante, can you give me some advice? And he said, your practice has to be your life and your life has to be your practice. There can be no separation. And at that point in my life and my practice, I really didn't understand what that meant at all. But there was something about it that just seemed like I would carry this with me for the rest of my life. And as I get older and as my practice deepens, this saying continues to unfold and to reveal itself to me. And I take that teaching very literal. So there is no separation between my personal life, my spiritual life, or my political life. One of the first times I sat on the dais on a full retreat at one of the big institutions that I've been sitting in for years, it came time for me to introduce myself to the room. And something in me told me that as a new teacher, I couldn't leave part of me behind. I had to bring all of who I was. And so I said, my name is Booker, and I'm my name is Booker, and I am a Black queer woman. I don't think I really had an expectation of how the room would respond to me. And it really wasn't important. It was about me bringing my whole self into the room. And so I kind of braced myself for whatever was going to arise, any backlash that was going to come towards me. And instead, what I experienced was a room full of people that took a deep breath and allowed their shoulders to slide away from their ears. I saw a room full of people who might have had this constriction around their hearts and their bodies become more open. I saw some tears, some smiles, some hands to the heart. And I felt a sense of folks in the room being able to land, to fully arrive, and to be in that space with all of who they were, all that they came there with. And I realized that putting my body out there, naming my identities, that it gave others the opportunity to bring their whole selves to this practice, to not fragment and leave that which is complicated to dominant culture to be left outside. What happened in the room was so much bigger than my personal dharma coming out story. It gave folks a sense of home and belonging. As I watch the news and I see the state of our current political climate, having my practice allows me to be able to map on the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. And that allows me to create more space so I don't slip into the hate that hardens my heart and refuses to see the humanity of all beings. And when I hit the streets to be in solidarity over the brutality of another slain Black, brown, queer, or trans body, I start with my practice to support me and gain clarity around my intention. Has my rage, which is part of my wisdom, transformed enough so I can move into skillful action? I start with my practice to know if this is mine to do today, or if I need to sit back and heal from the pain before engaging in action. The faith in my embodied wisdom is still something that I practice every day, that I continue to explore and test the boundaries of. And sometimes I fall down, but I pick myself right back up again. In my previous life, before training as a Dharma teacher, I offered yoga and basic meditation instruction to vulnerable populations in New York City. Those who were incarcerated, living with addiction, and experiencing homelessness. And there was a great need to rely heavily on embodied wisdom in order to do that work. To know when we're falling away from compassion and into pity. To know when we are offering from a heart-centered space and when we're offering more than we have the capacity to offer. And being able to track when we are taking on what is not ours. Embodied wisdom is about being radically present, to know and can unpack the systems in which we are working within. It means to know our conditioning, our projections, our biases, and to know that these first thoughts are not our own, but a social construct of the world that we live in today. To embody this radical presence as facilitators, classroom teachers, teachers of movement and meditation, means to fully be awake to what's happening inside our own bodies. The clenching, the shutting down, the pushing away, the turning away from, so that we can acknowledge it and choose to stay and be with the discomfort, because that is where our true growth comes from. And doing that work for over 10 years, there was a point that I stopped paying attention. I had tipped over into offering more than my body had the capacity to offer. And this imbalance and the ignorance around this imbalance led to me being diagnosed with multiple fibroid tumors and endometriosis, part of the legacy of historical trauma in bodies of African descent. In 2009, I had a surgery to remove 11 of these tumors. This opening up of my body, this going directly into my womb, which I had always identified as the seat of my intuition and my power, was a huge wake-up call for me in how I was doing my work. Directly after my surgery, we came to find out that I was having an allergic reaction to the medication that was being dripped into my body through my IV. And so I turned towards my breath and my body and asked if we could do this, if we could recover without these drugs, without this medication, these painkillers. So recovering from my surgery with my breath, being with my pain, being with discomfort and knowing that I could be with this, I could hold it, could experience it and have intimacy with it. I was able to find a rhythm in the sharpness to the dullness and to utilizing my breath to ride these waves of pain. I used my breath to move through the shame of the messiness of surgery, the shame of having to rely on my mom to care for me and clean me up, the shame of, I should have known better. I should have paid closer attention to my body. And I was able to breathe into gratitude to having woken up to this and having access to my breath and body to move me through this knowing and through my healing process. My embodied wisdom has shown up as my dharma door, my entry into my practice, as my protection, my guide, as my faith that continues to show me my truth. My embodied wisdom that is cultivated through my practice is not a luxury item, but rather a tool for survival. Thank you for your kind attention. And so, shall we go into practice now?
Yes, we'd love a practice.
All right. So I think it's a good time for us to really feel into what it's like to really explore mindfulness of breath and body through your felt sense experience, to really know the body. So whether you are sitting, standing, or lying down, I invite you to find a posture that feels best for your body. A posture that allows you to be alert and awake, and to also feel a sense of connection and grounding. So I'm sitting in a chair this afternoon, and I like to have my knees in front of my hips and my ankles directly below my knees. And so my legs are at this 90-degree angle. And I like to lift my toes and spread them as wide as I can. And then to move from the outer edge of my foot and placing my toes down one at a time. To lift them up again, spread them wide, and then start from the inner edge and begin to place my toes down one at a time. To lift up onto my toes, onto the balls of my feet. See if I can energetically feel this spreading, this widening of my heels, and then placing them back onto the earth. And so really feeling this felt sense of the four corners, of the bottoms of the feet, really grounding down, rooting down into the earth. And if you're taking a lying down posture for your practice this morning, you can bend the knees so the bottoms of the feet are resting on the earth, and you can explore that at the same time with us. And then feeling these four corners, the bottoms of the feet rooting into the earth, I begin to know what it is to feel this connection. And then I bring my awareness up through my calf muscles, so gently flexing the bottom half of my legs so that I know where they are. Rounding at my kneecaps. Knowing the space between the kneecaps and the hip joints. And taking a moment to feel into the pelvic bone. So whether you are lying down or standing or sitting, feeling the weight of your sits bones. If I'm sitting, I like to rock back and forth and front to back to kind of see where I am today. Being sort of a greedy type, I tend to lean forward into my practice. And so seeing if the body is leaning forward or a little too much off to the left or to the right, and just finding what feels like your center. So it allows your body to be in this present moment. So not leaning too much into the future or into the past, but allowing the body to arrive and to be present. I like to bring my hand to my lower belly. And as I breathe in, to feel the belly fall into my hand. And as I breathe the breath out, to feel my belly button reach back towards my spine as I let all of that air go. Allow my body to ground, to rest into the earth. To feel the breath lift and breathe in through my lungs. So feeling this breathing in, this lifting, this expansion of my heart, my lungs, my ribs. And as I breathe the breath out, to feel the breath breathing out through the back of my lungs. To breathe in, feeling the breath slide up towards my collarbones, and then breathing the breath out through the tips of my shoulders. And as I breathe out, to drop the shoulders away from my ears by bringing some weight to my elbows. So allowing the weight of the elbows to open the chest, to lift the heart, to gently slide the shoulders away from the ears. And then bringing the attention from my elbows down to my wrist. And from my wrist down to my palms of my hands. Through the length of my fingers down to the tips of my fingers. And for some of us, that isn't enough to allow the body to really arrive and to rest. And so I also sometimes, after I begin to ground my body, to maybe open up my eyes and begin to turn my head from side to side. So doing this with the eyes open allows me to resource to knowing what's in the room, knowing my surroundings. And I begin to track color. So noticing what is yellow, what is orange, what is green, what is blue in the space that I'm in. To notice the different shapes. So what is rectangle, what is round, what is square in the space that I'm in. To notice the length of the room. Noticing the width of the room, so how much space I have from side to side. And also noticing the depth of my room. So the space that is in front of me, the space is behind me. And so having a sense of my surroundings, I can then come back maybe into the body and knowing the length, the width, and the depth of my body. having a deeper sense of my body in this space, of the capacity of my breath to move in and out of this body. And bringing some awareness to the face and seeing if there's any holding or tightening or clenching in the face. And so I like to rest the tongue on the back of my teeth, allowing the jaw to unhinge, to allow some softening in the bottom half of the face, to know the breath as it breathes in through the nostrils and as it breathes out through the nostrils. Feeling the softness of the eyes. So for some of you, you might want to practice with keeping the eyes open. So looking at something in front of you with a soft gaze. So we're looking without really seeing. You might want to look down to a spot on the ground or to close your eyes altogether. To bring a softening across the forehead. And to move up to the crown of the head, I like to imagine a little door with a latch. So I can just unlatch that little door, opening it up, and allowing the mind that worries, the mind that makes lists, that plans, to take a break for a moment. And as we close the latch on at the crown of our head, we can drop back into the felt sense of the body. Being with the wisdom of the body and all that it offers us. All that it is telling us about our experience in this moment. And finding our breath in the body. For some, the breath might be very deep and fluid. For others, the breath might be a little shorter. For some folks, there may be like a stickiness in the breath, not quite finding the rhythm of it. But seeing if we can find a rhythm in the stickiness. Seeing if we can find a flow, a rhythm, a pattern as the body breathes itself in and as the body breathes itself out. And it might be useful for us to find an anchor. So as the mind begins to wander, finding a place in the body or the breath that allows us to feel a sense of connection, of coming back. It could be through the bottoms of the feet, through the connection of our sits bones on our seat, through the palms of our hand, or maybe through the flow of the breath. And can we keep landing once again as the mind might pop us out of the body? Can we come back to this grounding, to the knowing of the felt sense of a body landing? And knowing the breath as it moves in, and knowing the breath as it moves out with any judgment or trying to fix the breath. And just knowing that this breath is like this, and that this breath is just like this. And so perhaps taking a deep breath again. And when you're ready, you can begin to flutter the eyes open. And we can take a pause on our practice for right now. So thank you for your practice.
Thank you. Booker, I wanted to ask you about so many things, but I will start with the title of the presentation. Embodied wisdom is not a luxury item. One of the things that suggests to me is that many of us may view it as a luxury item sometimes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first came to my life as a teacher, the first work that I did was working with a very vulnerable population. So folks who are experiencing homelessness and living with addiction and who are incarcerated. And these were tools for their pure survival. Especially so many of the young people I worked with in jail, they were 12, 13, 14 years old. And they had come to this knowing, this understanding that because they had been told by society that they were prisoners, that they were bad, that they were never going to be anything more than this. And so these children are already not only behind bars, but locked inside their own prison. This is all they were going to ever be, that they could never be more than this. And so I realized that having them to explore these liberation practices, these practices of freedom, of spaciousness, of being bigger than what society tells you that you could be, these practices of liberation were everything for them. And unfortunately, in this world, when these practices first came to us, it became this thing that was a luxury item. If you have the money, then you could go to the $25 yoga class. If you have the money, then you could go away for 10 days and sit retreat. And for so many of us, especially those of us with marginalized identities and histories, having a spiritual practice has never been a luxury item. It has been our survival. It's how we have come together. It's how we have lifted each other up. It is how we have made it through. It's how we have survived.
You shared a beautiful experience of bringing your whole self and your bigger than self to the dais when you were introducing yourself as a Black queer woman. And it made me think of an experience that a friend shared with me once. He is a gay man, married, and wears a wedding band, and was in the gym getting ready for to play racquetball, and another man asked him, "Oh, where's your wife?" or "What's your wife like?" or something about his wife. And he paused for a moment and consciously chose, just as you said, you choose daily, you make a conscious decision to really show up and bring yourself everywhere. Mm-hmm. He made a conscious decision to leave that part out of it and said, oh, she's fine, or, and he expressed to me, you know what? I just want to be a man playing racquetball today. Because, and he had to go through a series of conscious decisions to arrive at that one. And so I'm curious about how you make your own conscious decisions about bringing all of yourself into whatever situation you visit.
And, I don't blame your friend. I mean, for some of us, it's simply not safe for us to, even in 2019, it's not always safe to divulge all of who we are, depending on the context that we're in. And I have a dear friend who really inspired me. He is a transgender man living with AIDS. And I remember the first time we began teaching together, I was reading his bio, and he says in the introduction, the first line of his bio, his identifiers, that he is a transgender man living with AIDS, working class. And it shook me. I was like, oh my God, that is so vulnerable and so brave. And as I began to know him, like, he can't be any other way. And like, that's who he is. And his identifiers influence who he is, the work that he does, how he teaches, the references that he brings into his teaching. And so there is no separation between who he is, his practice, his everything. And so I was so inspired by the bravery, and also seeing how, and working with him, people knowing who he is, it allows for other folks to be in the room who also hold those identifiers. And so, it was a conscious decision. It was a scary decision. And I've never turned back. Because when we are brave to put ourselves out there and to say who we are and what we stand for and what's important to us, it allows others to be seen, to be heard, to be validated, for them to have access to practice. So if we weren't there saying who we are and what we stand for, the practice wouldn't look like it does now. The teaching Sangha wouldn't look like it does now.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about separation from embodiment? Because you mentioned that you'd been dancing up until you were 19. Mm-hmm. And from there was a sort of a drifting away of that embodiment. Can you talk about what maybe were some major factors that were responsible for that?
I think part of it was just, exploring my autonomy, moving into young adulthood, and, what does it look like to not be a dancer anymore, and being in college and exploring, the rest of my life, my other interest. And during this time also were the early years of my activism. And so for me, not having cultivated a spiritual practice yet, it looked very raw and rough. And for me, being an activist at 19, 20 years old meant that I couldn't feel anything. I need to feel my anger, and then I need to jump directly into acting on my anger. And so I think that if I felt more, if I had, if there was intentionality, if there was a connection to the felt sense of my body saying, ooh, this doesn't feel good, then I would not have engaged the way that I did. And so I think that disengagement is just part of growing up, of testing boundaries, of pruning, as saying, does this work? Does this work? Does this work? And, I explored that for about 7 years, that magical 7 years. And I came back to really wanting to be in my body, to really wanting to know what was my truth, to having the experience of burnout and wanting to know how I could sense that and feel into it and stop it before I got deeper into this burnout and this exhaustion that I was experiencing.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that rage is actually part of your wisdom.
That's right.
And so and so by extension is rage part of our body, and how can we really sit with, maybe I want to ask you to come at this all from yet a different angle on how we can really come at the rage or the frustration or the feeling of inertia or stagnation, or however you want to put it, when we are coming up against something like pervasive social isms or fear from the culture, in any form it takes. Like, how does that set up in the body, and how can we attend to it, to this wisdom wisely?
Mm-hmm. In my experience, and maybe this is something that was cultural or something that I made up, but I thought that to have, a yoga practice, to have this meditation practice meant that I no longer had fear. I no longer had anger. I no longer had rage, that these were things that people experienced who didn't have the practice that I had. Mm-hmm. And so I think when I first came to my practice, there's a little bit of shame, and then also realizing very soon that, but wait a minute, this is part of me. Like, I can't separate this from my practice. There has to be some way to integrate and to navigate both, and because they both are existing, my anger, my rage, my fear, and my practice at the same time. And so I began to not fragment, to not say, well, that's the part that I don't want to acknowledge, because that's spiritual bypassing, right? So I really wanted to hold all of this and to experience it. There's this beautiful quote by Maya Angelou when she's in conversation with Dave Chappelle after he had come back from being, traveling through Africa for a long time. And he was talking about anger and rage. And he's like, how did you deal with it? How did you survive? And she said, if you don't, she's like, anger, you have to feel it. If you don't feel your anger, you are either a stone or you're too sick to feel it. So feel it, yes, but you can't let it overwhelm you and take over and become a cancer that lives inside of your body. And so she says, be angry, yes, but you dance it, you march it, you vote it, you sing it, you write it, you do everything about it. And so what Maya Angelou is speaking to is this transformation. So knowing fear, knowing anger, knowing rage, knowing that it is a catalyst, it is something for you to pay attention and to listen to see it as a catalyst to transform into skillful action, so that we can then use that energy to do something useful in the world. And, without my practice, I used it to push down and to shame other people, and not to try and be in relationship and to have an understanding of where they were coming from.
Well, it seems like that's an easy place to go to when we're feeling wounded, disconnected, angry, to keep people and the world at bay, because there is such an overwhelm. And we're feeling, tossed about by circumstances beyond our control.
Yeah, okay. It's very easy to be historically, like, you have always harmed my people. Why should I trust you? Why should I? And it's so easy. And I could very easily live in a bubble of people who, that we just lived in our rage. I could very easily do that, and I would be justified in it. And I know that what it does is that it manifests in my body as illness, as sickness, as disease. It manifests in my body as the greed, hatred, and delusion that are making, are creating the kind of harm that we see in this world. And so me, using the master's tools, as Audre Lorde says, is not helping to dismantle the master's house. It's just doing a lot of this. And so I actually have to show up with love. I have to show up with compassion, even to my enemy, for my own sustainability, for my own survival. I don't have to love them, but I also can't allow them to destroy and make me sick.
Another facet of that distancing or separation that I sometimes see, well, I see pretty on the regular, really, is people who retreat into their spiritual practice, or what they call their spiritual practice, because the world, or being engaged in the world, would somehow sully them or taint their spirituality, or maybe they're feeling a little too sensitive to the world and would just choose to send light from afar. Right?
We call that spiritual bypassing. Yeah. And
yes.
it's a thing. And I, it's funny because I thought, again, that my practice when I began would soften me, would take away my edge. And what it actually did was made me stronger. It buoyed me. It helped me to see things more clear. It helped me to not stand for injustices, and allowed me to know it, to feel it in a way that was so much more clear. I think that there was, some doubt. There could possibly be doubt sometimes as I'm engaging in the world, and, having the practice and having this clarity. Yeah, I think that there is a great support to our activism through our spiritual practice. And I think that there is a great support in our spiritual practice to be part of our activism. I think that they really need each other. There's no point in sitting on a cushion and having this clarity and this wisdom and this strength if you then don't go out into the world and do something with it.
Yes.
And I think that throughout the world doing something, you need to come back and seek refuge and rest, and to gain clarity again, to engage back out into the world. And so we need both practices. We need wisdom to balance out faith. And so we need to have these two practices to keep us in check, to keep checking in with with what we're doing and why we're doing it, to really know what our intention is. And if we are harming others along the way. So it's important for us to always kind of check back in with our practice.
You mentioned intuition a few times, and also body wisdom. And I'm wondering if there is a difference between the two, and if so, what is that?
That's a great question. I think for me, I conflate them. For me, it feels very similar. My intuition is a felt sense in my body. It's a tightening of my heart. It's a ping in my belly. It's I get these signs, and having embodied wisdom allows me to feel the signs of my intuition and to do something about it. So maybe intuition happens first, and then the embodied wisdom is actually knowing that is a sign to move into action, not just to be like, that was a weird feeling, and then let it go, but to actually move into action. Like, oh, that's something that I'm supposed to be paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. So often people might say, oh, something told me to do that, or, this something, and I am really interested in those in-between spaces, like for the person who is coming back into an awareness below the neck, of that awareness of that body, and tuning into its wisdom. It's one thing to kind of suss out what exactly is happening. Is it a gut response? Is it really is it information that's going to help you take the next step, right? And so because it is such a nuanced experience, it makes sense that, executing or acting on whatever it is, you deem as information or inspiration to take next steps, it would seem that that space is also nuanced, right? So if there's a tingle in the gut and you take that as information around a particular experience, and you're trying to figure out what that next step is, how do you suggest we keep from spinning up into the head trying to lay out a plan for steps because our gut tingled,
Yeah.
and also holding that softness or that openness for that wisdom to unfold outwardly the same way it showed up inwardly.
Yeah. So there is this pause in between. And we live in a culture where, we get triggered and then we respond. You see it all the time. Someone stepped on my shoe, I punched them in the face. Someone hurt me, so now I'm going to get back at you. So we have this very quick response time. And so what the practice has offered me is an opportunity to take a pause, to say, oh, something is arising in my body. So whether it's an internal thing or an external thing, right, that's happening, is to feel it, to know it, to acknowledge it, and then take a pause and to figure out how I want to respond to it. So this goes back to chitta, to the heart mind. So how am I responding? Am I reaching out with aversion and hatred? Or am I taking a pause and getting curious about it? And am I dropping into being inquisitive and to wanting to know more before I move into action? And so it's a very, very, very thin line between, being triggered or having something wake up in us and then responding to. And it's a practice, like all of us. And I think Robert Thurman says, you practice, like when's the actual performance? But, but the performance is how we respond, how we show up in our lives. Are we living a life now that is more fluid, where there is less harm, where there is less animosity and fear and hatred to others? Then that's a performance. That is our practice when we have taken that pause. And once we take a pause or 2 or 3 or 70 or 80, we begin to recognize it quicker and we begin to respond just differently in our lives. And just because it becomes part of who we are, not what we're doing, but it becomes like who we be, like who we actually are as human beings. So we're not doing this human doing thing, we're doing a human being thing.
Mm-hmm. So as someone who is hoping to or intentional about starting this practice, do you have any suggestions as to how someone might begin the journey down that path? I mean, without a particular lineage or experience or depth of knowledge in meditation, Buddhism, yoga, or what have you.
I think it's important to start with intention, always to start with your intention. Why do I want to explore this practice? To see if there is, the quality of the intention. For some of us, it's to get something from somebody to manipulate a situation. And for some of us, it's really about waking up. It's about wanting to alleviate the suffering of ourselves and those around us. And so first checking in with the intention. What is it in my body, in my system, in my heart that makes me want to turn towards these practices? And then for me, I came to my practice through Sangha, through community, before I knew anything about the Buddha's teachings trainings or any of this, I was invited into a community of people who were loving and kind and generous. And I wanted some of that. I was like, this feels good. This feels like this is how I want to live my life. What are y'all up to? you know? And I went and I sat for probably a year or two before I began to study Dharma. I went and practiced yoga for a while and just felt the felt sense of how it was to move my body before I began to really study yoga. And so for me, I think also being an embodied person, I started with like the felt sense, like I love the way I feel. And it wasn't a love, like there wasn't a grasping, a clinging, I want to possess it. It was like, oh, this feels like a natural state. Like I want my homeostasis to feel like this because it felt clear and grounded and spacious. For some people, their Dharma door is through study. So you might want to pick up like a bunch of books and study. So it really is, your like your access point. For me, it's people and embodiment. For others, is through the intellect. I believe there's like 86,000 Dharma doors. And so there's so many ways for folks to experience, to explore, and to know this practice. But nothing beats a Dharma friend, a Kalyana Mita, a spiritual friend. And so there's something about having at least one person on this journey with you. It's really, for me, it's the key. It's the thing that really allows you to continue in your practice, and to stay.
Booker, thank you so much for carrying us through the door today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having this conversation open for people to know about the wisdom of the body and how beautiful it can be.
The pleasure is ours indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. You heard it from Booker. I want to thank you all for being with us today. Please note that the recording of this session is going to remain accessible for free for 24 hours. And if you wish, you can purchase the entire summit with lifetime access to each recording, transcripts from each session, and bonus gifts from our presenters. For Sounds True, I'm Kriste Peoples, here again with Booker. SoundsTrue.com, waking up the world.